Thank you all. Many of you have been here through the entire 2 days. Welcome to the latest edition of EJUL Live. My name is Joseph Weil. Oh no, sorry. That's not the right situation, is it? Sorry, I got that all wrong. Welcome to the final session of the Philip Fest, as we've come to affectionately call it over 2 years of planning, hashtag Philip Fest. The first thing I'd actually like to do is thank not only my co-editors, who are substantially easier than Philip to work with actually, in the planning of this publication, which is impressive, but particularly in the last days and hours, all of the administrative and faculty staff of the Centre for Human Rights and Global Justice, who not only kept it from you, but brought this whole thing together. So
they've all been fired since.
It's been particularly, it's been absolutely fantastic, and as well as in the Dean's office at NYU, but Lauren and Penelope and Meg as well really made this all possible. And of course, we very much thank the Dean's office for providing us with the venue and the victuals over the last 2 days to have this wonderful event. So we've heard a lot in the last 2 days about our, as Cesar rather affectionately put it, our various origin stories and the connection with Philip, intellectual working connections and so on. And we've also heard a lot about what many of us think is distinctive, exceptional, remarkable about your approach to human rights, to politics, to law, and which for many of us has really marked your contribution and also what's been so edifying and important in working with you. So one of the things I'd like to do in this conversation is talk about, first of all, some of the origins of all of that. The second thing I'd like to do is perhaps bring us towards the end of the conversation to the present, and to maybe try and draw you out on some of your thoughts about the present and the future of human rights. I think a very interesting cross-cutting theme across this entire conference is not only the kinds of human rights scholarship and legal activism that you stand for, but the continuous challenge that you yourself have posed to human rights law and activism and how to grapple with the present and the future. And I think you yourself have been somebody who has taken that challenge seriously, but we live in particularly difficult and I think perilous times for the human rights enterprise. And many of us have indirectly, I think, grappled with that. So it'd be wonderful to talk about that as well. But let's start at the start. So you're born in Melbourne, Australia. Just in case anyone had missed the fact that Philip is Australian.
I have difficulty understanding his accent, but...
But one of the things that Theo van Boven mentioned, but which many people may not know, your first of all, you went to the University of Melbourne, and as a law student, I mean, intellectually, what was going on? You know, some people come here to NYU and they're formed by their engagement with their professors, with people like you, and that shapes their career. And that's been the story that some people have told over the last 2 days. But Philip Alston, in 1968 or 69, goes to Melbourne University.
I should ask my 2 sons to leave the room at this stage because the awful truth is that I was not a serious student, and in those days it was, and this really is shameful, but I have to admit it, it was cool to attend no lectures, and I excelled at that. Among the few friends I lost were those whose notes I borrowed a week before the exams and then did far better than they did. And so most of my time was actually spent on extracurricular stuff. There were two magazines at the law school. One was a thing that came out every week, which was a terrible scandal rag, and when I look back, sexist beyond anyone's imagination in this room. But we did that every week, and then there was an annual journal which was very sophisticated, and interviews with chief justices and all that sort of stuff. And again, I was the editor of that. I became the president of the Law Students Association, which in a context like NYU is hard to understand, because people would say, well, so what the hell was that about? You know, why did you bother? But the Law Students Association was very active on a whole range of things. It was a serious political body. I was on what was called the Union Board of Directors, which ran all the facilities and amenities for the university. And they were the sort of things that I threw myself into. The only thing that I really got out of it intellectually was that I was taught by, barely taught, but got to know Gareth Evans, who you would know, who subsequently became Australian Foreign Minister for a long time. But when I graduated from law school, he was then about to be elected to the Senate, but he was still a candidate, basically. But it was he who essentially got me my first job out of law school, which was in politics.
So I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture about the political climate.
Yeah,
in the
it was.
1970s in Australia.
Well, it was 1968. It was Vietnam War demonstrations. It was SDS. It was large quantities of marijuana and free sex for everyone except me. Yes, that was the era.
So one of the two interesting features of that era, which I'm curious to know whether they really had an impact on you. One was the rise of the Aboriginal rights movement. So from the mid-1960s, for those of you who maybe know this aspect of Australian constitutional history, Aboriginal Australians became citizens only in 1965. Until that time, they were not full citizens of
67.
67. And until that time, they were subject to the jurisdiction of the superintendent of Aborigines, who could control their movement. It was also the beginning of the Aboriginal land rights movement, and one of the watersheds of that was the Gurindji walk-off. Now, the person that you just mentioned, that your first job was in politics, but the first person you worked for was Australia's first ever Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, Gordon Bryant, who was a white Australian who had been very active in
all
the
of those
Aboriginal
events.
Affairs movement. Just tell, was that an influence on you, that experience of working for him in that situation?
Well, it was, this may be rather boring for most people, but it was a very particular context. I was 24 years old, just graduated from, or in fact I was doing a master's degree, but by thesis. I was actually at Melbourne University the only master's student in the law school because they didn't have what they now have, which is a vast program. The man you describe, who was the first minister and who'd been one of the great activists in all of these events earlier on, was dismissed from his job as Minister for Aboriginal Affairs by the Prime Minister because he had violated various rules, etc., relating to ministerial conduct. And so what happened was, because he was elected by the political party as a member of the cabinet, he couldn't be fired from the cabinet. So he was fired from that job. The minister then gave him about the lowest profile job in the federal cabinet. and told him to hire completely new staff who would not threaten in any way the existing bureaucracy. And so he hired me, age 24, as his principal private secretary, to use the term, so his chief of staff. But the job started off precisely defending him in his previous role, because what he had been fired for, the classic example was going up to an Aboriginal settlement in the far north. The people that he met with saying, "We freeze to death every night, you know, it's just terrible here and we've got nothing." And the minister turning to the civil servant who was with him saying, "Right, I want 5,000 blankets here by next week." And the civil servant would turn and say, "Oh, Minister, sorry, for an order of that magnitude you need to tender, and that requires advertising for 3 months, and then we'd be able to, you know, launch a purchase order." And the minister said, "I want 5,000 blankets here by next week or you're fired." And so the blankets were bought, but then all the financial rules were violated. And I think for political reasons that was then used to get rid of him. But the very first thing that I did was then to work with various people to defend the minister and to work with the various Aboriginal groups who were very upset that he'd been moved on. So there was a pretty solid engagement with all of those people, and that did have a pretty significant effect.
So, I mean, I know from Aboriginal activists that I've spoken to who remember that period, that minister is remembered with incredible affection, precisely for this reason, that he was ostensibly a political figure, but was simply willing to act directly in order to try to do something about the situation. And so the context was the Whitlam government, the most radical government Australia has ever had, then and now, responsible for introducing single-payer healthcare in Australia, for free university education in Australia. The political principles of this government...
ending the White Australia policy.
Ending the White Australia policy
people like you were not welcome in my country.
That's right. My parents came out a year after the White Australia policy finished.
Yeah.
So the climate was radical, if not revolutionary. And how did you feel a strong affinity with these principles, with the project of this government? What's your recollection of all that?
Well, there were 23 years of Conservative rule, and it was a very comfortable, white, upper-class government, which was not responding to any of the real currents, which was all the way with LBJ, was the big slogan in terms of Australia in the Vietnam War throughout that period. I think I became much more politically active because although I never joined a political party as such, but I followed all these things very comprehensively. I lived in the electorate in Melbourne, which was once held by the Prime Minister, the Conservative Prime Minister, Sir Robert Menzies. And it was then fought by a man named Andrew Peacock, who ironically really was a peacock. But he fought it over the Vietnam War, and we had the images of the dominoes falling, the red hordes, or the yellow hordes, I suppose, the yellow hordes who were always in red because they were communists, coming down to Australia. And that was the sort of rhetoric that I was brought up on. That was 1965, I was 15, and from then on, I was pretty highly politicized. So I think it did have a pretty big impact on me.
So you mentioned, I think yesterday, that the Whitlam government was dismissed after a constitutional crisis that had a lot to do with large amounts of international opposition to some of its policies and essentially a financial blockade that resulted in a government crisis that led to its dismissal. You say at that point you leave the country, you move to Berkeley. And so here's another figure, who was mentioned yesterday, which is the figure of Frank Newman. And you mentioned in passing yesterday that you sort of just decided to take one of his classes because the guy teaching property law and environment law was rather dull. But it turns out that Newman was a very significant figure, both in Berkeley, subsequently became dean, I think, and then a Supreme Court judge there in California. And he would take groups of students to Geneva every year. They called them the Berkeley crew. Were you a part of the Berkeley crew?
Not in the fully paid up sense, because I wasn't a JD, I was just an LLM and then stayed on to do a doctorate. So I didn't go over with Frank. It would be nice to, and I think Theo van Boven, who spoke yesterday, sort of presented me as one of Frank's boys. It's funny, I should be much more grateful, particularly in the context of something like this, to Frank, but he was a very odd character because he was utterly committed to human rights. He represented the struggle against the Greek colonels starting in '65 and so on. He took up very quickly the whole Chile cause, etc. But he was a complete formalist in every respect. There was no subtlety, no nuance. He came out of a sort of strict interpretation US administrative law background. I mean, I remember going to his class, I think I fled his class actually on administrative law when he said, so we're dealing this semester with the Administrative Law Act. So let's begin at the beginning. What does the word "the" mean? And I kid you not, I think the first class was devoted to what the word "the" means. And that was enough for me. I'm out of here. Frank was a wonderful opening, and he taught a class and brought in a lot of people and got me interested in human rights. But he wasn't a figure whose actual day-to-day work I could draw a lot of inspiration from, if I can put it that way.
So once you started in the human rights world in Geneva, we heard also yesterday that one of the things that you started working on for Van Boven, and also which attracted George Abissab's attention, was the idea of development and human rights. So I'm really interested to know how you came to that question. There's nothing obvious in what you've described so far that you would pick up first human rights in itself, but that you would immediately turn your attention to the questions of economic, social rights and development.
It's a very prosaic intellectual evolution, I'm afraid, because I had gone to Berkeley to study environmental law. That was my real interest. Because the environmental law professor was on sabbatical, because the guy who was teaching it had no interest whatsoever in the subject and just did pollution law, which didn't interest me. I then developed my own project, which ended up being on the international regulation of toxic chemicals. And I had not really done international law seriously until then. And I knew nothing much about toxics, but I was interested in environmental law. I ended up writing that up in the first semester, and in fact it was eventually published in the Ecology Law Quarterly, as I'm sure all of you know. God knows what it would be like to go back and read that now, but fortunately I haven't done that for 40 years. And so then when I took human rights in the next semester, I very simplistically linked the two and looked at where environmental issues fitted into the human rights framework. And that got that with the toxic chemicals thing, because in the toxic area there was already back then a lot of dumping in developing countries and so on. Plus I had studied economics at Melbourne, and I did do economic development and I took a course in economic development at Berkeley as well. So I was always interested in development issues, having spent, as we said last night, 6 weeks living in a very isolated village in Papua New Guinea at the end of my law degree, which also put me into that setting, although I couldn't then have articulated it as a development experience. But those two things just came together. And what actually happened in terms of what Teo described yesterday was that the Global South Coalition decided to launch this concept of a right to development. They had no idea what it meant and no articulation of what it involved. And so the way out was to ask the UN Secretary General to do a study on what it meant. And Van Boven and his colleagues had no one who could do it. And when I came along, they said, would you please write this? And so what I did for 9 months was simply to write that study, which I did entirely on my own. And the great bureaucratic experience I had, because bureaucracy is a terrible place in which to work when you're junior, was that I started doing drafts, and they had to go up first. Where did they go? They went through, they were supposed to go through a Frenchman who joined the UN in 1952, then up to an Englishman who joined the UN in 1947, and then up to a Haitian who was not quite that old. And that's a nightmare for anything. But the Frenchman was the real problem, the first level. And he kept saying, I mean, you know what Frenchmen are like. He kept saying to me, but you've used different language from the resolution, and you can't do that. And I'd say, but this is a report I'm writing. And he said, it doesn't matter, you can't diverge. And so every line would be crossed out, and etc. And I somehow drew this to the attention of Van Boven, who was the Dutch director of the whole outfit. And he was a rule breaker in bureaucratic terms. And so when the three of us met the next time, he said, oh, and incidentally, Maxime, I would like Philip to send his drafts directly to me and you at the same time. And then the three of us can meet, and you don't need to go through them in advance, which basically excluded the Frenchman, and I was then writing directly for the director, which was just a perfect situation. But that then led, I mean, just to give one, sorry, I shouldn't go on too much, but the irony which Teo didn't, he was being diplomatic yesterday, what then happened was that the Soviets developed a real phobia about me, that they thought that I was really going to cause problems. And so when I was then nominated for a regular job, the guy who was known, and this was how it was in those days, as the KGB representative on the Personnel Committee, simply said, there is no room in the UN for this man. And they basically had a veto over it. And Teo then got around it by saying, well, in that case, I'll set up a trust fund and hire him as a consultant.
So what was your experience in Geneva in the late 70s, early 80s? It's a period, so in sort of the evolution of the human rights institutions, you know, the Commission has become slightly more than an elaborate waste paper basket, that, as it was famously described. There's the quite relatively significant development of procedures concerning systematic violations under the sort of shadow of the dictatorships in Chile and Argentina and so on. What was the sense of being part of that machinery? I mean, what was your perception of it when you first encountered it? Because you're somebody who seems to know how to use it very well.
I was very privileged and very lucky, as I really have been throughout my career. Fortune has shone upon me. And so I arrived in Geneva to work in 1978. The previous year, this man, Van Boven, had been appointed. Up until then, the UN Human Rights Program had been run by John Humphrey, a Canadian, and then by Mark Schreiber, a Belgian. And both of them were pretty bureaucratic and not really prepared to challenge very much. They were just drifting along and doing what was easy enough. Van Boven came in as a, I shouldn't use the word because it sounds pejorative, but sort of crusading Dutchman who really felt very strongly about human rights, knew the whole scene backwards because he'd been working in it for a long time, and was not naive, but just prepared to do what needed to be done. And that created a whole new atmosphere. There was a sense that we could do things. And so a UN that had done almost nothing in terms of responding to violations in a whole range of countries, except for what we called the holy or the unholy trinity. The unholy trinity was South Africa, Chile, and the occupied territories. They were the only three situations that anything was done about. There was movement immediately on the genocide in Kampuchea, Pol Pot government. Finally, we managed, I had nothing to do with it, they managed to get movement so that there was a study initiated of what was going on. Van Boven then was instrumental in getting the UN to set up a working group to study what was going on in Chile, and to get the working group to actually go down and visit and to set terms for the first sort of on-country or sur place visits. And then there was the Argentine dictatorship, where the Inter-American system had moved already in 1978 and done a really damning report, but nothing could be done at the UN because the Argentines were too clever and they blocked everything. And again, Van Boven, which is why he means so much to me and why it was so lovely to see him there yesterday, was the one who really made a huge effort. And I remember it was 1979. We were at the Human Rights Commission. It met late at night in those days. It would just sort of keep going through until, I don't know what time, I suspect 9 or 10 at night. And I remember Theo crying out the back behind the podium, just round the corner here, because the Argentines had just succeeded in defeating the resolution to appoint someone to look at the disappearances in Argentina. And he was, personally just devastated by that, and then began the process of launching a comeback. And the comeback was this idea of saying, well, we're going to set up a thematic mechanism which has nothing to do with Argentina. It's going to look at disappearances. Disappearances in Canada, disappearances in Sweden, oh yes, and maybe Argentina and Brazil, why not? And that got through because it didn't have quite the same political toxicity. But they were great times in a way because there was a can-do determination to try to change what had been a very stifled bureaucratic mechanism around the Commission into something more serious.
I mean, is it fair to say that that's a context that influences, I think, a strong theme in your work, at least since I've known you, which is you're very realistic about these frameworks, the Human Rights Council, the Special Rapporteurship, but you've never really stopped believing that they have some possibility of making a contribution?
Well, I think you have to work with what you've got. I don't think there's any point in saying a certain person is now president, I'm walking away, it's a lost cause. It's going to be tough. it's going to be frustrating, but you've got to hang in there and do what you can. And I think that's certainly true with the UN. I don't think there's an alternative to the UN in terms of multilateral efforts to try to promote this conception of human rights. I think there's huge frustration. It's a big bureaucracy, and big bureaucracies are awful in many respects. But you simply have to do what you can. And I've always believed that individuals can do a lot if they really want to. It doesn't mean in a dramatic way, but just if you're sitting in your office, you can just write a report differently. You can prod a supervisor, you can prod a political actor to move something along. And that's what I've always been guided by.
So why did you decide to go into academia?
Well, that's ironic in light of what I just said, because I decided that I couldn't bear to remain in the bureaucracy. Because in the bureaucracy you're always doing someone else's bidding, you're sitting there taking notes. I mean, I decided to go, or to try my hand at academia at a time when I was about to take off in bureaucratic terms, because I set a lunch with the Austrian who Bruno Simmer described earlier, who was Kurt Waldheim's right-hand man and had been sent over from New York to put a lid on what was happening in Geneva. A man named Kurt Herndl, who turned out to be a nicer guy and a man of better faith than his background would have suggested. But I asked his office if I could have lunch with him, and my agenda was to say that I had been invited to Harvard Law School for a year and I would like to take leave. But he got in first and he said, "Philip, this is a big moment, you know, I've been mulling this for a long time. I've decided to make you Secretary of the Human Rights Committee," which was a job that was a couple of levels above where I should be in the bureaucracy. But there'd been pressure from various members of the committee who weren't happy with what they were getting and who knew me and really wanted to work with me. So that would have been a great moment, but it was very clear, you know, being secretary of a committee means that you have the opportunity to say to members, why don't you think about doing X? But you're not allowed to say, you know, the way you're doing it now is just a disaster, this is ludicrous, you have to do X. Whereas if you're a member of the committee, you can. And so the prospect of being a member of the Secretariat for another however many years was one that horrified me.
So you begin your academic life.
In fact, there was a very bizarre moment in the middle of all this that I've sort of blocked out of my mind, but it was a pretty dramatic moment when the Secretary General of Amnesty International, who I'm delighted to say is apparently a contributor to this volume, Thomas Hammerberg, came to me and said, "Philip, we have a vacancy for Deputy Secretary General and I'd really like you to apply." And I was then 31 years old, which was very junior still, but I applied for it. And I went to London and so on and was interviewed, and then at the last moment another candidate appeared who was far superior, named Pepe Zalacat, who was a Chilean former prisoner of conscience, leader of the Vicaría de Solidaridad, was actually probably either the chair or the vice chair of the International Executive Committee of Amnesty and knew it all. And he, of course, got the job and I didn't. which, you know, you look back in retrospect, life would have been very different if I'd ended up going to Amnesty International at that age. My career trajectory would have been totally different, I'm sure. But it didn't happen, but I knew that I didn't want to remain a bureaucrat. I wanted to be able to make a difference.
So when you begin in your academic career, so you'd expressed a kind of already dissatisfaction with the kind of strict legalism which characterized perhaps also your university education at Melbourne. What did you understand yourself to be doing as, as an academic? How did you conceive, you're there, for the first time Harvard has a human rights program created by Henry, into which you're now one of the originating contributors. Did you see yourself as, well, my job is to explain the law, or how did you understand your function?
Well, the truth is, and I think this is very common to a lot of people who come to US academia in particular, that I had no idea what US academia was all about. I had assumed it wasn't very different from Australia, where, you know, you do a bit of writing, you do a bit of teaching, you do whatever you want to do. There's no great hierarchy, there's no, I had no idea of the elements of the career ladder to become a US academic, which is very strong. You know, there's a set list of criteria that one is supposed to meet in order to break through to the ranks of becoming an academic. It's a highly privileged, highly sought after position, but I waltzed into this with no real sense of any of that. So I just sort of kept doing what I was doing, which was combining involvement with a range of different human rights groups and issues with writing about them in what, in retrospect, is a very naive and simple sort of way. None of the complexity, none of the theorizing and so on that US academia expects. And it took me, I think, quite a while before and in fact, I spent one full year at Harvard and then moved to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and kept teaching for one semester every year at Harvard Law School. But the Fletcher School was a great experience for me, because there were, again, people who were all practically engaged in one way or another. But it was, again, very far from being an American law school, and so no particular pressure to publish anything in particular, and none of the sort of criteria that law schools apply. But I wasn't particularly career-minded in a sense at that stage. I wasn't saying I desperately need to get an appointment at a law school or anywhere else. I was happy doing what I was doing, which was combining teaching with practice and writing.
So around this time you play a very important role in the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a legal advisor to UNICEF. I guess my first question is really the impulse towards the creation of a specific convention for the rights of children. Was that something that you'd always had an interest in, or was it something that came on your plate because, you know,
no, again, it's serendipity. I mean, I think that's one of the things that stands out for me, at least in my own career. These things just happen and I didn't plan them well. The reality, this is terrible. I was actually asked to write something on the rights of children. I think it was for the early, Max Planck Encyclopedia of International Law, if I remember. And that was back in 1984 or 85. Up until then, it was a subject about which I knew nothing. I was then, however, I had been active long before that in what's now called Anti-Slavery International, the Anti-Slavery Society in the UK. And they were big on children, particularly in the context of slave labour, of sexual abuse, child marriage, and so on. So I did do some work for them, I think maybe on child labour at a certain point. And that was enough for maybe them to draw me to the attention of 3 people in UNICEF who were engaged in a subversive exercise to persuade UNICEF to start looking at rights issues. But UNICEF was resistant. UNICEF's position was that it had nothing to do with rights. They were all dealt with in Geneva by the UN rights people, and that would only politicize them. So I was hired as a consultant by this group, which was called the Group Working on Children in Exceptionally Difficult Circumstances. And that basically meant children in war, children in sexual exploitation, children in trafficking, I guess, and child labour. That was all. And they were sort of seen as exceptions. And the role that what they said to me was, look, we want you to persuade UNICEF to get into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the drafting of which had begun in 1979, sponsored entirely by Poland, as a communist exercise because it was all focused on the fact that children had economic and social rights. They didn't have any other rights. And of course, we all, well, outside the communist world, had misgivings about that. But my job in UNICEF as a consultant then became to persuade the executive director of UNICEF that they should make this big move. And the director, I mean, I've told this story a number of times, at least in private, never in public, but was a charismatic American named James P. Grant, Jim Grant. And he really was a great reformer, very dedicated guy. But at a certain stage, we had a private meeting, and he said, listen, Philip, you teach at Harvard Law School, I understand. Yes, Jim. You probably don't know this, but I'm a graduate of Harvard Law School. Yes, Jim. So you and I should know that when lawyers get involved in things like children, all they do is screw them up. Doesn't help to get bound up in legalism and so on. That's not what I want for this organization, Philip. And the conversation then had to move on, and eventually the only card that I could play, I mean, I guess this is consistent with what some of the things that were said earlier today, that in the discussion I had to think to myself, well, how do I convince him? How do I bring him around? What's in his interests? And the trump card ended up being me saying, Jim, look, the bad news for you is that this exercise has now been going for 7 years. It's got up a lot of steam. It's got a lot of support from states, and it's going to happen. You've got 2 choices. You can stay on the sidelines and try to pretend it's not there, or you can get in now and you can shape it, and if you want to, you can try and own it at the end. It's up to you. I know what I would do. And very quickly he said, okay, let's see what we can do with this. And so I then became the legal advisor to UNICEF. I was in their delegations for the rest of the drafting process and so on. And stayed quite close to him, at least in the first period of having to sell it to states, which we did in the final year, 1989, etc. There were lots of meetings up at New York, up at the headquarters here. I remember, I mean, it was sort of symptomatic of Jim Grant. I'm going down memory lane now, but, and it's almost a silly story, but it was Halloween. So it would have been October 1989, and the convention was adopted in November of 1989. And we had a meeting with a dozen ambassadors and it was just Jim and me, and the guy who was hosting was the Norwegian ambassador. And Jim comes into the room and says, "Here, Philip, make these." And what he gave me were cardboard Halloween money collection boxes that I had to get together. And the Norwegian ambassador looks over, and now I'm going to do something that I know is politically incorrect, but says, "Philip, I don't think it would be a good idea for you to be making those money boxes. The ambassadors don't like this, and it's not a good way to be able to persuade them." And Jim Grant looks at him and says, "Don't be silly. Come on, this is ridiculous. It's important. These people have got to put their money where their mouth is. You know, this is, children matter, not just in the convention, but they've got to contribute." And the ambassador was adamant, saying, "No, Jim, we want to persuade them. You can't do that." And Jim just sort of turns around and says, "To me." Okay. And of course the money boxes were made and a collection was duly taken up. But it was just an example of what sort of person he was in terms of just, you know, roaring ahead with these things. And he then became a great champion of the convention. And UNICEF then ensured very quickly that it got close to universal acceptance. Again, in a very pragmatic exercise that I was quite heavily involved in. They decided they didn't really care what terms countries ratified on. And so one of the roles that I played, I was back out in Australia at that stage, and I'd get a fax in the morning saying the UNICEF advisor has a meeting with the Malaysian Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2 days from now. Here are their reasons why they don't want to ratify. Give us answers. And so I then had to go through and say, look, you can tell them they could make a reservation on that if that's how they feel. Tell them that that's not going to be interpreted in this way, etc. And that, again, was an amazingly successful campaign. Albeit questionable in the sense that if you're a purist, you'd say, but look at all these reservations. It's not a good foundation, but just to get the convention up to universal ratification in a very short period of time seemed to be a good goal.
So let's talk about economic and social rights, because that's one area which is, I think in many ways you're most closely associated with as an academic, and to which your contribution has been enormous. I guess the first question I really want to ask you is, when you joined the committee, and in the 9 years that you sat on it,
12,
what were you trying to achieve? What did you see as the point of this exercise?
Well, I saw it all about, I mean, the social rights were completely untheorized, basically. No one had a good sense of what exactly was meant by the terms used in the covenant. No governments were taking them seriously. There was almost no real practice. And the committee that I was elected to, which was brand new, inherited abysmal procedures from its predecessor, which were totally bureaucratic and meaningless. And so the challenge was to do something on those two fronts, both substantive and procedural. I had, as someone mentioned, maybe Georges mentioned it yesterday, actually written twin articles on those which were published in the year before the committee first met, one on procedures and the other on substance. And so that gave me an agenda, basically. What happened, Bruno described it at lunchtime today. We met a solid communist bloc led by the Soviet expert, so-called, but backed up by a Pole and a Romanian. And they made it absolutely clear that there were to be no innovations of any sort. And they blocked almost everything. I was elected as the first rapporteur of the committee, essentially at the insistence of these three guys from the communist bloc. which was very puzzling to Bruno and to a Frenchman who were much senior to me, and was explained to me by the Romanian about 5 years later when we'd become good friends. And he said, well, Philip, I hate to tell you this, but we looked at the various Western representatives or Western experts, and we decided that you would be by far the least effective and junior, and that's why we chose you.
Never underestimate underestimation.
Right. Yeah.
So we're exceeding our time a little bit, but I want to talk about two more issues, which in a way kind of bring us to the present. So one is, by the 90s, the complexion of human rights law and politics has changed a lot in some ways. All of this normative investment, all of this cautious legalism has paid a huge dividend in some sense. There's mainstreaming in multiple international institutions, and in addition, there's some sense in which the language of human rights in law and politics has become a lingua franca for all sorts of claims. Certainly someone who grew up in that period, I think it was very visible and tangible. You're, by that stage, already a very established scholar. You've led institutions, you've led committees. When you looked back at the end of the 90s, one might say we'd had our first war under the auspices of a human rights claim, humanitarian intervention in Kosovo. We'd had 10 years of sanctions against Iraq by the end of the 90s, almost 10 years. What was your reflection on where the human rights, where human rights law was, but also, I mean, were you worried? Were you worried about overreach, or did you think, well, we're basically going in the right direction, we've got to fix a few things?
I always had a rather different perspective in a sense. I was not someone who was working primarily on the standard issues. So if I'd been working on torture, I think I could have been triumphalist in the sense that in the mid-1970s, you couldn't talk about torture because government said this is an outrage. You're not suggesting that any government tortures, I hope. And you know, Amnesty had to fight that tooth and nail. They eventually got a convention, which even the United States was blocking towards the end, and then finally Argentina, of all countries, the new government, Alfonsín, comes in and makes a plea to the United States saying, if there's one thing we need, it's a torture convention. History has shown us that, for God's sake. So the Americans surrender, let the torture convention go through. It's very progressive in a whole range of ways. Amnesty then, you know, keeps chalking up countries that have promised never to do it, have started to legislate. And torture is genuinely looking as though it's a thing of the past. I think from those sort of perspectives, huge progress. I was still working in the twin minefields of economic and social rights as such, but also what we called mainstreaming, which was trying to get non-human rights organizations to take up human rights. And among those was the World Bank, for example, or UNDP or others. And I knew full well that those organizations were not taking up human rights. An organization like UNDP today even will tell you that it's got human rights in there and blah, blah, blah. It doesn't. You know, these are marginal, they are not appreciated by the great majority of staff. There's terrific resistance. And I'm not talking about even social rights, I'm talking about, so I was always working in places where I was constantly aware of the opposition and the resistance. And I resigned from the Economic Rights Committee at the end of 1998 on the grounds that I'd been there too long, that I realized that it needed new blood and that I needed new challenges. I needed to get out and do something else. But I was genuinely tired of banging my head against a brick wall. I was, for all those years, I was the token participant in conferences. I was like women were for quite a long time. You know, there'd be 10 panels or whatever at a conference, 9 panels would be dealing with men, and then the final panel they say, and now we have a panel on women. Where are the girls? Come on, girls. And I was instead the social rights boy. You know, so we'd have 9 panels on serious civil and political rights issue, and then they'd say, so, now we'll do the social rights. Where's Philip? Philip! And at a certain point I got sick of that, and so I decided I would go on and work on other issues. So I wasn't, there was never any likelihood of triumphalism on my side.
So in a way this brings us in some respects to the present. So the one way of telling the story of the last 20 years is an enormous rise in the confidence and self-confidence of human rights groups, some considerable success of mainstreaming, an apparent a number of relative victories when one thinks of accountability through international criminal law, the proliferation of norms against certain kinds of human rights norms. And yet the last 3 or 4 years have suggested that those achievements, even as legal achievements, are incredibly fragile. That in some ways they inhabited a space that was not of their own making and could be taken away from them very quickly. So I'm curious to know your own reflections on the durability of not just your legacy, because of course we're very happy to announce your retirement today. But
is this a message from the Dean, or?
He couldn't be here to tell you himself. But indeed of that enormous amount of activity, of the investment of hopes and energies of anyone who understood themselves as having some sort of progressive vision in politics, and where could you locate that desire to improve the world? Well, for at least 2 generations, I think human rights has been an answer. And it's interesting to think about the present as to whether that is and continues to be the object to which one would direct one's energies.
Well, lots of things to say about that. First, I mean, you mentioned the ICC and all that sort of stuff. I was always very conscious that what you had in terms of institutional and other achievements, if the starting point is here and the end point is here, total human rights respect, the institutions down here had reached about this far, and then suddenly we jumped to the ICC, which is really almost right at the other end. And so there's nothing in between. There's these incredibly weak institutions where you come in and report a genocide and they say, oh my God, that's disgusting, we're going to adopt a resolution. And then you say, that's really going to do it, and they'll say, well, we can have a follow-up resolution if you really want. And you might play with sanctions or whatever, but nothing serious. And then suddenly the ICC, where you're actually hauling people off and charging them, and heads of state and so on. So I don't think it was ever a particularly sustainable spectrum. You've got to build up to these things. I think, however, because I've usually been involved in fights of one sort with governments and others, I've always been acutely aware of how fragile the commitment of most governments is to human rights. And one thing that those of us who have been in the human rights movement for decades know, of course, is that you take someone who is utterly exemplary, César, and you say, César, you've been so good, we're going to make you foreign minister. The chances of César remaining César as foreign minister are depressingly slight, despite what you know as a man of huge integrity, commitment, involvement, and all these different things. And so you see over the years these wonderful people who just have moved on. They think they can do something else. they then behave like normal governments and say, well, sorry Philip, we've got to take some shortcuts here, we can't let these people get in our way, we've got a vision. And I think it is just a continuing struggle, and always will be, that those of us who are in power are never going to have human rights as our principal preoccupation. We very quickly convince ourselves that there's a range of other objectives that need to, if necessary, trump rights. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I think that's the challenge for human rights proponents. They've got to constantly be battling from behind. It's constantly pushing uphill. But I think it is an illusion to think that you're ever going to, quote, win that struggle, because there will always be new battlefields. And I don't think that's changed. So I'm not pessimistic right now. I mean, these are certainly grim times for human rights, but I think to the extent that we believe in these fundamental values, and they have stood the test of time in a great many ways, whatever we say about them, I think they are of enduring relevance. I think the problem is that over the 20 years of glory, if that's what it is, most, and César has written most compellingly about this, most human rights people have become complacent, have become very stuck in a particular routine of how they promote and talk about rights. And I think that's what we're all realizing has to change. The human rights movement also has been very much about top-down, and top-down is not to be dismissed. There would be no torture convention, there would be no LGBT recognition formally of rights were it not for a certain top-down movement. But that cannot survive, cannot get anywhere in the absence then of bottom-up. Which has to be a key part of it, and I think we've ignored that. We had all the victories, we set up this committee and that committee, and we adopted this treaty and that treaty, but didn't then, I guess, take my analogy with the ICC, you know, that we're back here, we've set up a treaty, we've set up a committee, but then there's all this way to go, and you can't just assume then that the rights of peoples with disabilities, the rights of LGBTI people, etc., are simply going to be respected. This fight has to begin, the struggle. And I don't think those of us at the international level have wanted to acknowledge the extent to which that fight needs to be hand-to-hand, door-to-door, local sort of struggle to transform understandings.
So Philip, with that, I think we've reached the end of this very...
Solved the world's problems.
Solved the world's problems, but we've also, I think it's been absolutely tremendous to have you with us for 2 days.
Let me have the last word just to say thank you ever so much, particularly to the principal co-conspirators who I think are the three of you, Sarah Nucky and Meg Satterthwaite, for having organised all this and brought it together. It was a genuine surprise. I never thought that I would get tired of talking about myself for 2 days, but I've almost had enough. But it was wonderful, and I'm very appreciative of all the friends who have come here today and yesterday and talked about so many things that I found fascinating. And seem to keep most of the rest of you awake, but thank you again. And thanks particularly to my family who are at the back there and who put up with a huge amount of absences and other burdens in order to make all of this possible. So thanks to you all.